This is an examination of the hidden human condition.
This is the Hidden Killers Podcast.
The Hidden Killers Podcast.
With Tony Bruschi.
Whenever we're examining these cases, there's two things that we have to be vigilant of. There's one, the human emotional side to things. The way that we would act as a human being who cares for one another. And then there's the legal side of things, where even if you want to act as a human being that cares for one another, could you be putting yourself into such a liable position that being a good person could easily backfire on you? It's a sad proposition, but it's reality. It's the world that we live in, an insanely litigious world where you may have the best of intentions and you may want to be there for others, but your attorney says, do not do this, because if you do that, you could be showing something that will be attacked on you and will cost you later for doing that right thing, if you will, in your mind. Certainly, we're not talking about holding back information or lying or concealing evidence, but sometimes it gets to be a very, very long tightrope that one has to go down and figure out exactly how to balance that act. That may have been exactly what was going on and still is going on with the Laundrie family, Bryan Laundrie's family, from the Gabby Petito murder case. We're talking with trial attorney and professor of law at Cornell Law School, Randy Zelin, about this case. There's so much to unpack here. And I want to talk about the parents of Bryan Laundrie in a little bit. But first, I want to touch on Eric Pratt, the former police officer who was named as a defendant in the lawsuit that seeks damages in excess of $50 million in the case of Gabby Petito. The police department saying that we acted with kindness, respect, and empathy towards Miss Petito. Yet in a statement after Eric had stopped and interviewed them and talked to them, made the statement that there was more red flags than a Chinese communist rally with those two, essentially. In this case, are we dealing with some true liability here on the police departments? And I know it's easy to do Monday morning quarterback, but was this something that really was handled improperly?
I think it's very difficult to answer even your question, because we get into a tug of war between our heart and our head.
Okay.
And our heart tells us, my God, could this have been avoided? Could law enforcement have right then and there have seen enough to pull her out of the car? Could law enforcement have done something to separate the two of them, or to put the two of them somewhere where one could not hurt the other? And of course, it's so very easy to say that in hindsight. But imagine if law enforcement, let's say, had separated them, had taken him into custody, had taken her. They could have been facing separate liability for doing that. So I don't know, as we sit here right now, that any of us are in a position necessarily to judge the action of law enforcement, because we all know in hindsight, again, that this was an unspeakable, unfathomable, and impossible to understand tragedy.
That's interesting that you bring up the liability that they could have faced had they actually taken those steps that they're being criticized for not taking. What kind of liability would they have been facing in that sort of situation?
Well, you're talking about a wrongful detention, something along the lines of an unlawful imprisonment. Now, it's different when law enforcement does it, but the concept is the same. It would be an unreasonable seizure. I mean, we could start ticking off a laundry list of potential claims against law enforcement. I'm driving with my wife and I get pulled over and you just decide you're going to detain me. Why? Because you don't like the looks of things? That's not how we proceed in this country. But again, in hindsight,
Sure.
with the benefit of hindsight, you say, listen, you should have taken that kid and tied him to a tree.
Mm-hmm. Is that why we have more situations like this where people in hindsight look and are critical of law enforcement? Because law enforcement also has to run all these scenarios through their mind as well of, if I do take this action, if I do step in and I do arrest or detain one of these individuals, there is that liability over here on me. So they have to make kind of a split-second decision of either I'm going to take on this liability this way or it's that way. Either way, there's some sort of a risk involved for the decision making of the officer involved.
And it's one of the reasons why it's so difficult to be in law enforcement these days, because we have become such a judgmental society, such a litigious society. Mm-hmm. And I'm not suggesting that law enforcement bears a fair amount of the weight for that, and they brought it on themselves, but it almost becomes a which comes first, the chicken or the egg. Mm-hmm. Did we create law enforcement, or did law enforcement create us? And I don't profess to have an answer to that, but to your point, that of course is one of the reasons why police officers individually generally have immunity mm-hmm. from what they do in the course of being police officers, and they won't be sued personally. They won't be brought into court personally. They will anyway, mm-hmm. but they will have the ability to make a motion to dismiss, which is time consuming. It's aggravating. Nobody wants to be in a courtroom, even if you ultimately do prevail. And of course, it's a filing on a public record, but it really allows us to segue into the next part of the conversation, which is when we talk about hindsight, we talk about hindsight in terms of the way Mr. Laundrie's parents behaved mm-hmm. subsequent to the trip. And of course, some of the things that happened before the trip. And again, we look at them with the benefit of hindsight.
We do. I mean, even when it was going on, though, I think a lot of people, and myself included, were being very critical of them, going, how are you not communicating with at least the other family, with the Petito family? Just if you put yourself in that situation with your own kids thinking, oh, there's the parents over there, we're the parents of this one, and, you know, they're a couple together. Of course you'd communicate and try and help the other search for their...
But I will push back on this, and okay. I will get a lot of flack for doing it, but I am now fulfilling my responsibility as an attorney. Mm-hmm. And I will tell you in no uncertain terms, if I had even a whispering, even an inkling, even one hair on the back of my neck standing up, that at that time, mm-hmm. in that moment, that Mr. Laundrie could have been viewed as a suspect or a person of interest, mm-hmm. I would have instructed the entire family, including the parents. Mm-hmm. You cannot have communication with anyone, including Miss Petito's parents. It's a horrible thing for me to say. I hate doing it as a human being, but as an attorney, you can only talk yourself into trouble. So it would not surprise me in the least.
Yeah, and that's, I think,
if it were an attorney that said you can't speak to them now, could it have been handled differently from a public relations standpoint? Could an attorney have gotten behind the microphones and have said, "Listen, I just want to set the record straight. Mm-hmm. Any lack of communication, any lack of getting together and holding fireside vigils, that's on my instruction."
Sure. And that's what I think was very much lacking there. Not that it really mattered in the long term to the public's perception, but it certainly does for the damning of reputations.
Right. There it would have been and should have been a matter of hate the game, don't hate the player. Yeah. Or hate the attorney. Sure. Don't hate the client.
Sure. I mean, I completely understand and agree with where you're coming from. And I think that's where I was thinking the whole time. An attorney said, don't talk. It would not be in your best interest. At this point, though, are we looking at anything where they could have known information and could have actually played a role in helping or healing, if you will, that family? Was there something wrong if they knew that Gabby was dead and nothing was said in that time window while that search was still going on?
While in a vacuum, that conduct may appear to be outrageous and unconscionable and horrifying legally, it was appropriate. For the protection of their son, for the protection of themselves, they, in my obligation, again, as an attorney, not as a father.
Sure.
As an attorney, they were not under an obligation to disclose anything. Therefore, in my opinion, their behavior does not rise to the level of having intentionally inflicted extreme emotional distress on Ms. Petito's family.
This is an examination of the hidden human condition
This is the Hidden Killers Podcast.
with Tony Bruschi.
Love to hear your feedback on these cases. You can call us toll-free 24/7 at 888-5-KILLER. That's 888-554-5537 to weigh in with your opinion. Be sure to press subscribe wherever you're downloading podcasts so you don't miss any of our breaking updates and discussions on the cases we're following for you right here. Even get an ad-free experience of the show through Apple Podcasts when you sign up there. My name is Tony Bruschi. Stay with us.